1920s, Americans were enjoying the fruits of a new prosperity. The greatest industrial nation fizzed ahead in a post-war boom. For those who had money, it was a time to get rich quick. Believing they could only win, 1 million Americans had their money in the stock exchange. In just 4 years, their shares roared up 400%.
It was rank speculation. There were going to be 2 chickens in every pot, and everybody was going to have 2 automobiles. And everybody and his uncle would be calling me up buying stocks. They never asked what price they were going to pay. You just bought them, and that was all.
Then, on the morning of October the 24th, 1929, the unthinkable happened.
All of a sudden, these orders started pouring, and everything was sell. It was just down, down, down. The market kept going down.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in market prices.
Investors who'd been counting paper profits found themselves plunging into real debt. Telegram boys like Bill Bailey were sent door to door, delivering the bad news.
The people would get the telegram, open it up, and go into a state of shock. Most of the telegrams said the same. The things are bad. We need more money to hold up your interest. Give us more money or else you're kaput. Then come back an hour later saying you better hurry. We're going under. And it was the same person getting telegrams left and right until finally they just shut the door because they knew what it was. And it was shortly after that that we found out that people were jumping out windows, going bananas, trying to reconcile their differences, figuring that was the best way to go, you know, head first.
The crash affected people far beyond Wall Street. The greatest victims were not the wealthy, but working people around the world. Capitalism had promised progress and prosperity for all. Instead, it delivered mass unemployment and the breadline. From the debris came a new demand for action. Throughout the 1930s, people would press their leaders to bring back their jobs.
Can't get no way, can't draw no pay. Unemployment getting worse every day. Nothing to eat, no place to sleep. All night long, folks walking the street. Doggone, the panic is on.
Americans like Bill Bailey were caught in a vicious downward spiral.
I couldn't find a job. I'd get out and maybe hustle 15 places a day, banging on warehouse doors, stuff like that, trying to find a job. Impossible. I ended up selling apples. And it wasn't easy, you know.
Doggone, the panic is on.
Within a year, 2.5 million had lost their jobs.
Especially in New York City, there was nothing that struck the imagination more than seeing a soup line of 500 people. Then 2 days later, 1,000 people, the same line. And they kept on growing and growing till they went around the block.
Laid-off men were driven to despair, victims of a process they couldn't understand.
We haven't got no work, we can't get no work, we're looking for work. We can't get no work, but we will by someday in the future.
As people had less to spend and trade slowed, more factories closed in one country after another. It seemed unstoppable forces were at work, which individual governments could do nothing to control. In South America, countries like Chile suffered immediately because they depended on trade with the United States. Chile's copper miners had prospered in the 1920s. But the good times were over. Fernando Liborio had just started work.
Cuando vino el crash en Estados Unidos,
when the crash happened in the United States, quite honestly, nothing like it had ever been known before.
no había conocimiento de algo semejante.
It was as if you were walking along the street and suddenly something hit you.
Y queda aturdido. Porque esto estaba muy lejano.
To us, it all seemed very remote, miles away. New York was a long way off.
Pero en cambio, cuando a uno le
But when your own boss tells you you haven't got a job anymore, then you really felt it.
Entonces, sencillamente, ahí sí que hay impacto fuerte.
Copper brought in 80% of Chile's foreign earnings. Tens of thousands worked to prize it from the biggest man-made hole in the world, in the desert of Chuquicamata. Justo Ballesteros was a contractor to the mine company.
Con ese crash de Wall Street, sencillamente, se cerraron fábricas.
After this crash in Wall Street, factories in the United States closed and they stopped buying. They stopped buying copper and all the raw materials produced here. This paralyzed the market here and so directly affected the entire working population. People were ruined, companies went bust. It was a crisis.
The slump was even more devastating for Chileans who produced nitrates, shipped to farmers all over the world as fertilizer.
El pan de nosotros eran las salitreras.
The nitrate works was our daily bread. It was our security. There wasn't anything else. Where else were we going to work when the desert was so vast?
Claudina Montaño Diaz's family were all nitrate workers.
Un día en diciembre, nosotros en nuestra casa, pues ya
One
mi
day in
marido
December we
llegaba.
were at home and my husband came back from work. Listen, he said, they're closing it down. And we had to go. Soon they were sending the people away.
Repartiendo la gente. Y la gente humilde, ¿qué iba a hacer?
And what could the poor people do? Pick up their suitcases and accept whatever happened. Who could we turn to?
Tantos pueblos para el norte, todo eso quedaba abandonado.
So many towns in the north abandoned, all abandoned.
Todo quedaba.
That was the crisis of
Esa fue la
1930.
crisis del 30.
Thousands of unemployed miners headed for the capital, Santiago. The government, now bankrupt, was overwhelmed by the numbers. Fernando Liborio was better off than most. He had somewhere to stay.
Entonces mi tía me llama en la mañana, me dice,
My aunt called me one morning and said, look what's going on in the street.
nosotros por la ventana.
We looked out the window and saw them lifting people up by the feet and arms and piling them onto a cart. I asked if they were drunk, but they weren't drunk. They were dead. They died of hunger.
Chile's plight was echoed round the world. Trade collapsed. Without copper, nitrate, or any other cargoes to carry, merchant shipping was idle, and no new ships were needed. Britain had been the biggest shipbuilder in the world. Towns like Jarrow in the northeast were entirely dependent on the industry.
I started working there
Palmer shipyard as a rudder catcher, hoping that that would be there for life. But it didn't happen, because one afternoon, when foreman come round and says, "Con, you're finished tonight," just like that. So that was me out. My case could be multiplied by hundreds. Now, in work 1 minute, then the next minute, out. So I wasn't alone.
The owners of the oldest shipyards were paid to close down for good, so the newer ones would have less competition. Jarrow's twin cranes were scrapped as the town watched.
It was just part of your life. Honestly, there were some women with tears in their eyes, seeing them go down, because they knew that that was the finish. Once they came down, the yard was finished. They were a symbol. Eh? Once the symbol had gone, that's it, we're out. Terrible day. Once the yard had closed, it was as though a blanket had dropped over the town. You know, there was nothing they could do. We just hung around the streets.
3 out of 5 Jarrow workers were now unemployed. The government said the only way to end the slump was to cut public spending and wait for what they called natural recovery.
We must all join as a united nation and bear equitable sacrifices to see the present crisis through. And so I appeal to you all. Do your bit like men and women, cheerfully and heartily.
But there were no grounds to be cheerful in Jarrow. The only help from the state was the dole, guaranteed for just 6 months.
Things was bad in Jarrow. I'm telling you, it was only 26 for a man and wife, and 2 shillings each for each child. That was 32 bob for 3 kiddies. Nobody knows what they were like. Well, it's like that old song, isn't it? Oh, how I miss my relief, now that they have stopped my door. Oh, I found 3 kiddies to keep, and not a shovel of coal. The landlord, he's coming tonight. He's coming to chuck us all out. There's no hesitating, the workhouse is waiting. Old pal, how I miss my relief. That's it.
In the United States, there was no dole. In Chicago, the new poor tore the wooden blocks from the city streets to use as fuel. In 1929, John Tackman had arrived from Sweden, hoping to find the land of opportunity.
They saw the misery all around me. Thousands or tens of thousands of people evicted from their apartments, whole families. And old people sitting in rocking chairs and chairs on the sidewalk, nowhere to go, no food. They could starve to death because there was no social security. There was no unemployment insurance. There was nothing.
I ain't got no home, I'm just a roaming round. Just a wandering worker, I go from town to town. And the police make it hard wherever I may go. And I ain't got no home in this world anymore.
By 1932, more than 13 million Americans, 25% of the workforce, had no job.
I decided that I should head west. In that period of time, there was only one way to get around, and that was by railroad, by boxcar. Some of the cars you get into maybe had 15 other guys in it. Wherever you'd hear a rumor that a job was opening up, thousands would be sitting up on top of the car. You have to pick the car up when it's doing 5 or 10 miles an hour. After that, I mean, you're taking the chance of losing a leg. But you learn all of these things as you go along, something new every day.
And now we're going to give you a real inside view, an actual interview in a genuine hobo jungle.
What are you doing out here, bud?
That's my business, partner.
How about you?
We have special invitation out here.
Out here for the climate.
What about you, son?
I'm just riding.
How about you, mister?
I have a friend who's going to get all of us a job.
Well, I'm employed in Colton Yard as a Southern Pacific switchman. It's been my observation that every freight train coming into Colton has from 50 to 150 or 200 tractions on them.
We're talking about professional people, scientists, doctors, lawyers. All these people are thrown into this pit.
Land is your land, and this land is my land.
John Tackman left Chicago for the farmlands.
I went across the Rocky Mountains to try to get a job as an apple picker.
This land was made for you and me.
And there were at least 25,000 without job coming from all parts of the United States. So I didn't get anything to do. You saw the farms, there were miles of them, and they were all surrounded by fences. And the kids could get over the fences. You saw apples on the ground everywhere. Big, big apples, the biggest I've seen in my life. But there were always vicious dogs sneaking around among the trees.
Angry farmers sometimes dumped their produce. Prices had almost halved. By destroying food, they hoped to reduce the stocks available and so stop prices falling even further.
We knew that when people didn't have money to buy bread, the wheat was burned. There was a huge destruction of food in the United States. At the same time that millions were starving. Millions and millions were starving.
All over the world, the same contrast between plenty and penury was repeated. In Belgium, there was plenty of coal at the pit heads. But Belgian miners had to break into their own collieries at night to scavenge for waste coal to heat their homes. The men's pay had been slashed, and then they'd been sacked after going on strike. The living conditions of one miner's family were filmed.
We slept on the floor. Some slept in the table with straw, the others slept on the floor.
Et puis les autres dorment par terre. Ça c'est moi. Alors moi je suis dans
That's me, in the cradle because I'm ill.
Et alors papa il retourne la table.
My father's turning the table round, otherwise there isn't enough room.
On n'a qu'une place là. On était à 9.
There were 9 children.
Ah, c'est moi.
That's me.
Maman qui sert les pommes de terre.
My mother's serving the potatoes.
Voilà. Voilà les pommes de terre qui sont servies, c'est tout.
There are the potatoes.
C'est tout ce que vous avez donné.
That's all we were given.
Comment est-ce qu'on a pu vivre comme ça?
How did we live like that?
Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time.
And all over the world, governments said the same thing, that there was little they could do to ease their people's suffering.
Brother, can you spare a dime?
In America, the shack settlements of the unemployed were called Hoovervilles, in ironic homage to Herbert Hoover, president for the first 3 years of the slump. He told Americans they just had to let the crisis run its course and tighten their belts.
Brother, can you spare a dime?
The same conventional wisdom was taught to Robert Nathan, then studying economics.
The professor said, business cycles are part of the capitalistic system. And I remember one day he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a rubber band, and just to have it handy, and he took this rubber band and held it in his hand, and he pulled it way out and said, boom. Then he let go of the hand, and it collapsed back very rapidly, collapsing down, and he said, bust. And he said, boom and bust, an inherent ingredient of the free enterprise system. To me, this made no sense at all, because I saw that here were the plants closed down, here were the people wanting to work, here were the people that couldn't afford to buy anything, and so that you had a kind of a vicious circle operating, and nobody was prepared or willing to undertake major measures.
While Western governments stuck to the line that the world economy was something they had no power over, their citizens grew increasingly impatient. Some governments were shaken and others brought down. Bewilderment turned to anger.
When I came down the street and saw my mother on that soup line, I knew damn well that something was haywire. Something was rotten with the whole system. I became receptive to listening to a soapbox speaker after that. The one that made you interested was the communists. Nothing to see a speaker. Almost on every corner, pounding away against the system. This is the result. This is what's happening. Your people are in soup lines. Your people are begging for clothing. You can't pay the rent. The furniture is being thrown out on the street. This is the result of capitalism gone bananas. And the only way we're going to reconcile it is dump capitalism.
Many people were attracted to the alternatives to capitalist democracy which emerged in the 1930s. For both fascism and communism claimed there was no need for mass unemployment. By comparison, the efforts of democratic governments like America's and Britain's seemed puny.
What could I come up with? Nothing. I couldn't come up with that because they all followed the old capitalist system. It was a new world and politics was changing, and over the years politics became more authoritarian, and then they was changing. And you was either going to join with that sort of thing, or that modern trend of politics, or drop behind.
Sid Bailey put his faith in the solution of the far right. He joined the British Union of Fascists. Its leader, Oswald Mosley, had resigned as a junior minister in 1930 when his radical plan to solve unemployment by government intervention had been rejected.
He was a far better speaker than Mussolini, Hitler, Goebbels, or any of them days. He was the greatest speaker in the world at that particular time. I can't put it in the words because you only have to live for it to know what it was like. People were staying up and the ovation would be terrific. Terrific. It took you 2 or 3, 5 minutes to quiet the people and stop the applause before he spoke.
And I claim that in the ranks of our black shirt legions march the mighty ghosts of England's past, and their strong arms around us, and their voices echo down the ages, saying onward.
Despite the clamour from right and left for action, the British government wasn't diverted from its orthodox economic line. Elsewhere, countries continued to turn to political extremes. But there was one country where the demand for intervention came from the centre. In Sweden, the growing Social Democrat movement campaigned against the Swedish government's inaction.
I joined the Social Democratic Party partly because I realized that they were getting things done.
Att jag såg att man gjorde. Jag såg ju
I saw unemployment as a terrible scourge. I was convinced one had to do all one could to remove that scourge from the Swedish people.
Sweden's plight was not inevitable, said the Social Democrats, if the government spent more public money to create jobs. In the election of 1932, the Social Democrats came to power under Per Albin Hansson. Swedes now had a man who claimed to be a people's prime minister and went to the office on a tram. Swedes were paid real wages to rebuild their country. There was government money to help fishermen and factory workers. The Social Democrats didn't try to balance the nation's books.
There was no question of cutting back on anything, rather of finding more things to be done. Pushing forwards instead of going backwards. That's what I looked for in a party.
Swedes were promised a folkhem, people's home, where the weak would be protected. Foreign visitors came to study the Swedish middle way and a government that was neither fascist nor communist, but whose stated purpose was to put people back to work.
Number 3 cheers for the bonus that we're going to get.
With nowhere was the contrast greater than the United States. In 1932, Washington was under siege. The Capitol building was surrounded by unemployed First World War veterans from all over the country. Their only assets were the bonus certificates they'd been given on leaving the army, which promised a cash sum years later. They wanted them paid off now.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945.
That brought you to Washington?
Well, to beat the undertaker, spend the money before the undertaker gets it.
I know who's made this country worth living in. It's just you fellas. Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Take it from me. This is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism.
President Hoover had to decide what to do about the veterans when the Senate rejected their demands. The marchers had stayed on, camped out in central Washington.
It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865.
I knew something was going to happen, that they might be attacked. And I had a press card, so I passed the police lines, and then I saw the soldiers advancing into the camp. And when confronted with this, the men all stood there and said, "Stand firm as long as you can." And they started throwing tear gas. I'd never seen anything like it. They systematically went down the line, burned up all the tents and all the possessions of the people there. I was thinking of Herbert Hoover when this happened, because his election was in 3 months. I thought this would be the finish of Hoover.
The orders of the president must be obeyed, and the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army. In the shadow of the beautiful dome of the Capitol of the United States of America.
That summer, Americans were rallied by a new message.
This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
Roosevelt ran for the presidency saying the Depression could be beaten.
What's our campaign slogan, Sissy?
Happy days are here again.
Good, that's right.
The American people gave Roosevelt a landslide victory to make him the first Democratic president in 12 years. He offered a new style and a new confidence.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
I was there. I was there at the inaugural. He had a great voice and he had a way of putting words together that made you feel this man means something to me. This man is going to help us. But what he would do, I didn't have much of a sense about it all. I don't think anybody did, but it was a great speech.
I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
When he took office in 1933, the country was still in the full grip of the Depression. 4 out of 10 industrial workers were unemployed. But however grim the situation, the new mood was irrepressible. Roosevelt described his program as bold, persistent experimentation. The message was expressed in 2 words. He called it the New Deal.
Get it with it. Here is on. Down on the border post and prominent. Those factory wheels are harming it. And millions are drumming it now.
In a matter of weeks, Washington was transformed by the rhythms of the New Deal. New agencies were created, new officials hired. The administration tried to kickstart recovery and tackle unemployment. 16 major measures were put before Congress and passed in the first 100 days. There was immediate help for American farmers who were facing ruin. Beef was fetching only 2.5 cents a pound. The Stoops family suffered from the low prices on their farm in Oklahoma.
President Roosevelt came on the scene, and what he done was that he would pay the farmers for a cow because there were so many cattle and not enough hay or water, and so he would pay like $30 or $35 for a cow, and they'd kill them. And they'd pick a good one, and then they would take it to the canning factory, and they would can this meat. And then they would give it to us, you know, not always your cow or anything, and we'd get so many cans of this meat.